War is a great accelerator of inventions and their exploitation. If peace had generally prevailed in the first half of the 20th century, as it had done for most of the 19th, the innovations of the Wright brothers and Blériot would no doubt have been slow to mature. Furthermore, the ways in which they did develop might have proved irrelevant to the needs of warfare. War in itself, much more than in the possible prospects of it, generates the most important advances in machinery and weapons. None more so than airships and aeroplanes, which were seized by the compelling appetite of war when they were scarcely beyond their early age of infancy. Before the First World War, flying had caught the imagination of the public, and within a short space of just a few years, all of the major nations were developing aircraft. Louis Blériot had taken the first major step forward in powered flight when in June 1909 he became the first person to fly across the English Channel. This confirmed the belief amongst some countries that aircraft could eventually have a military role. Germany was one of those countries. As early as 1884, she had developed the use of lighter-than-air balloons as observation platforms, and by 1910, out of the 26 large airships in the world, 14 of them were German. But the military was still not convinced of the aircraft's ability as a weapon of war. Although the armies involved had planned at the outset that this was going to be a war fought by a campaign of movement, it was quite the reverse. The First World War was to become a war of the trenches. The armies found themselves caught in a static struggle between increasingly sophisticated and ever denser defense systems. Two giant armies of equal strength were trapped, facing each other in a network of trenches with no way forward and no way back. But as the war progressed, so too did the development of new weapons and machinery. The sheer power of new mass-produced weaponry then available gave the armies no alternative but to go to ground, for this was above all a war of artillery, the German army being much better equipped at the time with heavy guns. The tank was also going to prove its worth. The mortar was used for the first time. And hand grenades, which had become obsolete 200 years previously, were again brought into use. Perhaps one of the most important advances in mechanized weaponry was the machine gun. The very nature of warfare itself was rapidly undergoing a metamorphosis, with new techniques in artillery and infantry tactics. With the position of each side and the location of reinforcements becoming more and more important, it became increasingly necessary to find an alternative and more accurate and comprehensive means of reconnaissance. This was traditionally carried out by the cavalry, but far-sighted powers felt that here was an ideal use for the aeroplane. It became obvious that the chief thing an aircraft could do in war was survey the enemy. Two-seater scout aircraft were sent out by both sides to monitor enemy movements and positions. Special cameras were developed for use by the observer. On occasions, these scout aircraft also dropped primitive bombs on the ground troops below. But as intelligence of enemy movements became more valuable, it also paid an opponent to try and prevent its gathering. And aircraft soon began to arm themselves, first with rifles and revolvers, and then with mounted machine guns. The types that had been specifically designed and used for reconnaissance by Germany were all similar in specification. Companies such as Albatros, Rumpler, Pfalz and Aviatik all produced aircraft for the role. Originally, the pilot had sat in the rear seat with the observer seated up front, but this was later reversed when it was found that the gun position mounted in the rear had a much better arc of defensive fire away from the hindrance of the wing struts and braces. Most of them were powered with Mercedes engines and could fly at speeds of nearly 150 kilometers an hour with a flying ceiling of around 5,000 meters. Designers soon began to think of aircraft not just as platforms of observation, but as fighting machines. These new fighting scouts, as they were called, first appeared in 1915 and began to do battle with each other. The British adapted their original reconnaissance machines, such as the FE-2B, with its added armament on a free-rotating ring fired by the observer. But in Germany, things were different. The Dutch designer Fokker came up with a new machine specifically designed for the job. The Fokker monoplane. This was fitted with an interrupter gear to make it possible to fire directly through the propeller, thus enabling the pilot to aim the aircraft at its target. A fundamental principle of air power emerged, the ulterior motive, observation of the enemy. The appearance of the Fokker monoplane in May 1915 placed a new meaning on this concept. It was the very first fighter or pursuit aircraft in history. Very soon the British pilots were talking of the Fokker Scourge.